Hello, I'm Steph from iDriver Classic, and today we're talking about pre-war cars because I feel like there's a big misconception out there that the world of pre-war cars is just drifting away and it's disappearing. And actually, I've noticed on my channel, and I've noticed on other people's as well, that the interest in pre-war cars is really growing and gaining momentum. And so actually we need to talk about it today. Now, it's all very easy for us to sit there and do all that navel gazing and say, oh well, I think this or I think that. And actually what I thought I would do is go and speak to someone who has spent more than half their lifetime in the world of pre-war cars, and that man is Roger. Now, Roger's a really interesting man, and I'm going to ask him some questions and try and unpick his layers like an onion and get to some of those really interesting bits that I love so much about Roger. Now, I met Roger because this car, if you've been watching iDriver Classic for some time, featured on the channel in about 2020, and we spent a whole day together and we had such a good time that I've kept in touch with Roger, and I would say we're almost pen pals because we'll write to each other and then we'll meet up when we can. So we usually see each other at Bewley Auto Jumble or different car shows that we both go to, and we catch up on things that are going on. Now, I bumped into Roger at the pub last night and I said, Roger, let's do a video on pre-war cars, talk about it and demystify it. Now, Roger, how did you get into pre-war cars? Because your first car wasn't a pre-war car. Tell us the story about your first classic.
Yes, my first classic was actually a Morris Traveller that was given to me by a maths teacher at school. It needed restoration. My family at the time didn't have very much money, and so my only way of getting a car was to get, you know, one of my own and sort of do it up. And I'd always liked Morris Minors, and so it was like a dream come true, really.
How did you learn to drive in it? Because I love this bit of the story.
Right. So I got the car slightly before my 17th birthday, so by the time it was back together, I was at university, and my father drove it down. I was at Bath University, drove it down to Bath, which is its maiden voyage after many, many years. And then some friends of mine at uni taught me how to drive. And then I had a few lessons to top up, took my test, and that was that.
And the really interesting thing about this car, and I'm going to put the registration, what is the registration number? Remind us.
RAX 873G it was.
We looked this up in the pub last night and it is still out there somewhere on Sawn. So if you have that, because the ownership hasn't changed since 1998, please drop us a message, or you know where it is, because I think Roger would love to get his teeth back into it. We're trying to get him back into the Morris Minor ownership.
Yes, just don't look too closely at the quality of the restoration work that I did. I was very young at the time. But yes, I had great fun with that car. I mean, that really, really set me on the road for classic motoring.
But how do you jump from a Morris Traveller, which at the time would have been quite commonplace, a lot of people would have seen them out and about in the 1980s, into something much older, into a pre-war car?
Well, it didn't happen all at once. I had this crazy notion, because I've always been into retro stuff, that I was never going to have a modern car, and I was going to get older and older cars that were more and more capable. And I thought, well, in the 1930s, you could, if you had enough money, you could get quite a decent car. So that was my plan, was to gradually work up in performance and what have you. And so the first step on that road, so I got a Rover P4, a Rover 110 that I drove for about 20 years as my everyday car. And about halfway through that, I decided that I would like a pre-war car, again, purely on aesthetics. I knew nothing about pre-war cars at all. I just wanted, because I like the look of them. And I started looking around and cut pictures out of magazines, went to see a few cars that I liked the look of, tried to fit in them, found I couldn't fit in some of them, found some of them were no good. And then eventually I found the 1935 Standard 9 that Steph featured. And that was my first 1930s car. And it was a steep learning curve, I can tell you.
You talk about this learning curve. What did that entail for you?
Really, it was sort of about parts and maintenance. 30s cars take a lot of maintaining. I think some of the service items on this, like the grease nipples on the suspension, are sort of 200-mile service intervals.
Really?
Yes, you have to be out there with a grease gun at the weekend, you know, keeping things going. The first time I drove it, it broke down, the cylinder head gasket went.
Wonderful.
I found that somebody had bodged up all the studs in the cylinder head.
Really?
I was fairly capable mechanically by this stage anyway, but I wasn't prepared for the layers of bodging you can get on an 80-year-old car. Because all this stuff at some point has been somebody's banger, you know, and they've just kept it going at minimum cost. So I would say, yes, I hadn't been prepared for the reliability issues to begin with. But let me just say, I do think 30s cars can be reliable, but when you first get one, if it hasn't been well maintained, it probably won't be.
I think that's the same with any classic car. Like, honestly, some of them are baptisms of fire. I mean, I'm not going to name and shame my own cars, but it's not Nanted, it's not the Proton, that when I've got into them, and in fact, I wouldn't even say the Marina was that bad, but I've owned others, my Triumph, and they have been absolutely dreadful. And you're just unpicking someone's bad handiwork for months and months and months, and it can make you feel quite dispirited. How did you get through that painful point into the car being reliable? How long did that take? How much money did you spend? How many hours did you work in the garage?
Well, I'm a bit of a strange case because I actually quite enjoy doing that. So I didn't have a stopwatch on it. You know, I don't know how long it took. A few years, yeah. I mean, to get the sort of reliability bugs out of it, not long at all. You know, change the points, change the condenser. You know, make sure that the fuel system is clear. That type of thing. You know, I mean, there's only two things that will stop a 30s car: lack of fuel or lack of spark, and you know, or something major like braking. But that's fairly unlikely. So to get it basically reliable, not too long.
Now then, you didn't just stop at one, did you? How many have you got now?
Well, yeah, I've got 3 30s cars now. The second one I got, the 10, which Steph has also featured, came to me by accident. By this stage, I was quite embroiled in the Standard Motor Club, and I used to go to events. And I used to take pictures of cars that I liked the look of. And I rang up about some spare parts, and the parts weren't right. And the chap said, oh, well, I might have a whole car. And I thought he meant in bits.
Yeah.
And when I asked about it, it turned out to be the 10 that I'd seen that I liked. And it took quite a long time for him to decide that I was the right person to get it, which I quite liked, actually. He wanted to make sure it was going to a good home.
That is nice.
Yeah. And I'm still friends with him now. And yes, so he's still in the club. He bought another 30 Standard, so perhaps he shouldn't have sold it to me. Yeah, so that was the second one. And then the third one, which is an earlier car, that's a 1931 car. I was helping a friend restore it, and basically he decided he didn't like it when he got halfway through the restoration. And then he sort of slowed down with the restoration. So I said, here's another Roger, go on Roger, can I buy it off you?
Yeah.
And he said yes. So I got it back here, and I thought, I'll get this back on the road for the summer, and it took me a year and a half.
Really?
Yeah. The whole house, the garden, everything has gone to pot because I spent so much time getting this car back on the road, but I love it.
And how many? I mean, there can't be many Standards from the 30s that are left. Do you know how many there are?
I would say it's in the hundreds rather than the thousands.
That surprises me. I thought it'd be less than 100.
No, there's quite a few. It all depends. Further you go back in the 30s, generally speaking, the fewer there are, just because they made fewer of them. But the mid-30s cars like this is probably the most plentiful model, the 34, 35, 36, 10, and there's probably about 100 of these left. So you do have a problem that you don't have with other makes, where because there are not so many, then the parts are harder to get. But in the 30s, Standard was, I think, the 3rd biggest manufacturer.
Was it really?
But first and second were way, way higher.
And who was first and second?
Morris and Austin.
Oh, okay.
So very often when I'm out and about, people say, oh, that's a beautiful car, what is it?
Yeah.
And I'll say, it's a Standard. And they'll say, what, an Austin Standard or a Morris Standard? I'll say, no, a Standard. Everybody's heard of those two makes, but not of Standards.
No, well, Standard closed when? The 1950s?
Well, it's a funny story. They bought Triumph in 1946, And then they manufactured cars under both badges. They tend to make the family saloons under the standard badge and the sporty models under Triumph. And then I think 1963 was the last standard badged car that they made.
I mean, that's essentially a lifetime ago. So
Yeah.
it is sad because they've made such quality vehicles. I mean, you can watch the review of this and you can see that the quality is exceptional for its time and the way that it's lasted as well. So for people watching this and they're looking at this car and saying, Roger, it's nearly 100 years old. You're going to have to sell it to me. What is it about 1930s cars that make them an attractive motoring prospect?
I think you've got to be into the look of the thing. You've got to be into that era, that technology. As a means of transport, if I'm honest, you know, my parents live up in Yorkshire. I'm not going to drive to Yorkshire in this car, not if I don't have 3 days to spare. If I want to go down to the shops, you know, pop round to a friend's house for the evening, it's absolutely great. So primarily I would say it's an aesthetic thing, it's a technological thing. You know, if you're into the whole retro scene, yeah, it's that.
You're not frightened of a few miles though, are you? Because talk about your trip to Goodwood Revival last week. How many miles and what did you do? Right,
and that's not the worst one this year. So yes, we took the 10 down to Goodwood Revival. It was about 195 miles there and back.
Yeah.
The drive back was better than the drive there. It took about 3 hours. So this will cruise at 40 miles an hour endlessly, quite happily. So we went on the back roads, some beautiful country roads actually. But yes, it was absolutely hammering it down on the way there. So you do have wipers, but they're not that great. You don't have a demister, so they're wiping the windscreen. So they do say in these 30s cars, particularly in the winter, the human is the weakest element, really. So, but yeah, it didn't miss a beat. It drove beautifully the whole weekend.
So they are very capable then?
Yeah. I mean, you've just got to be aware of the limitations. I think that's a really good point, Steph. One of the things that the mistakes that people make, the misconceptions they have about these old cars, and it probably applies equally well to the 50s cars as well. And I think Ian touched on this in his video of, I think it was a Austin Heavy 12 or something, is that people look at these cars and they think they look old, but they think they just drive like a modern car, and they don't. And I think as you go back through the 30s, I mean, if you're looking at getting a 30s car, think about the driving experience you want, because as you go back through the 30s, it gets more and more like working a machine and less about just getting in a car and going somewhere. So this is sort of about halfway. We've got synchromesh gears, but still you are very much working the machine. Yeah.
So at what point do you go from fully crash box, so that's no synchro on your gears, to that world where you start getting synchromesh on the gearbox?
Well, Standard introduced synchromesh on 2nd, 3rd and 4th in 1934. So for them, 34, as you mentioned in your video, is a big year. I'm not sure, I think one other manufacturer might have been using synchromesh earlier. So that's, the 30s is a really interesting period because things were changing so quickly. So yeah, end of the 20s, beginning of the 30s, most cars, crash boxes, possibly 3-speed, cable brakes or rod brakes. When you come up towards the end of the 30s, virtually everything's got synchromesh, probably 4-speed gearboxes, better suspension, engine mounting, different body construction. So this is a sort of mostly all steel car. Beginning of the 30s, you probably find that most cars are ash framed with.
Oh yeah.
And of course that comes with its own maintenance issues. I don't know if it's fair to say that I think that probably most coach-built cars are in the process of falling apart, and it's just, you just live with that. So yeah, a later car would probably have steel body, be slightly easier to maintain.
Now, you've got a lot of experience with these. If somebody is watching at home and they're watching you and they're thinking, I would love to be like Roger, I'd love to have a 30s car. You've had a Morris Minor, so a lot of people look and they say, oh, a Morris Minor is a great first classic for somebody. Compared to something like a Morris or a Mini or an MGB, how hard is it to work on these? Is it difficult?
No, it's not difficult to work on them. The main difference is the driving experience, I would say.
So you need that same level of mechanical sympathy and skill to be under the bonnet.
Yeah, I mean, you perhaps have to, for the parts you can't get, you probably have to be handy enough to make things yourself.
I will issue a caveat though, that you get cars now from the 80s and 90s where you have to have things made, that you have to have things remanufactured for you. Cars from the 60s, I had to have my input shaft remanufactured for the Triumph 1300. This is not unusual. So if someone's watching it and they're saying, that's what I'm going to hinge my decision on, now that I know that, don't be deterred, because unless you go for an extremely popular model like the aforementioned Morris Minor MGB Mini, something very generic, or maybe a Beetle, and you're going to go for, you know, the most popular example, so you wouldn't even be able to go for a low light Morris Minor because you would struggle for bits on those. You'd have to go for a Series 5, then you are going to probably come up against that, where you are going to have to maybe enlist somebody with an English wheel to make a panel. You are going to have to go and see somebody to have something re-sleeved or something along those lines. So don't let that put you off. Now, if we're talking about 30s cars, Roger, and young people are watching this, or there are people that are very dismissive in saying, young people just aren't interested, what do we do to get over that hurdle, to find those young people and to interest more young people in this? What do people need to do? What do owners need to do? What do parents need to do? What do people that run college courses need to do to keep the love of these alive and to grow it?
Well, do you know, that's a really interesting point, because I think the most important thing you can do if you've got an old car is use it. Get out there, go shopping in it, you know, just get it seen. I mean, I go to Morrison's in this and I have to allow extra time for people to come up and talk to me about it. And very often the people that come up are not people in their 40s or 50s. I mean, some of them are, but a lot of them are younger people in their 20s. And you were saying earlier about there's a resurgence of interest. And I think you're absolutely right. I don't know what's driving it, but I think especially much younger people are somehow drawn to the pre-war cars. I don't know whether it's Peaky Blinders on the telly or what it is, but yeah. I think the interest is coming. But I think all the ones that I've spoken to seem to think that it's out of their reach. I mean, only yesterday I was down at Screwfix or something, and the guys that were working behind the counter said, oh, did you come in that old car? Can I come out and have a look at it? Aww. So I let them come out and they sat in it and this, that and the other. And they were quite surprised to find that it was affordable and that they could probably get insurance for it. So I think we need to get the message out there that, you know, it is within reach of people. You know, it isn't necessarily going to cost them an arm and a leg, or they're not going to be get insurance or something like that. So
there are some really interesting things going on which I do think are helping. So number one, there's a really nice young chap called Ryan Goodyear. I don't know if you've met him.
No, I haven't. No.
He's got some fancy pre-war cars, and he's running a group on Facebook for young people under the age of 30 with pre-war cars to all meet and collaborate and learn from each other, which I think is such a powerful thing.
Yeah.
You've got the Classic Car Loan Project that are doing some really great things. You've got the Morris Register. They've got a loan car. They had a young woman in it a couple of years ago up in Barnsley. She was lovely. I think her name was Katie. So I think all those things are hugely helpful. But for owners, what do they need to do to try and attract young people? Do you think they need to be going out to schools, colleges? What do you think owners should be doing? Because I think it's on all of us to keep the interest alive. Yeah,
I think there are lots of things that we can do, apart from just being seen out. I mean, I lend my cars to people, actually. I lent my 35-9 to someone to take to the rally this summer, and they absolutely loved it. You know, they took a bit of adjustment to the driving, and they absolutely loved it. And they may well go on to get a classic car of their own. Or, you know, on a smaller scale, if somebody comes around, they show an interest, take them out in it, let them have a go, and sort of dispel the myths about that they're impossible to drive or what have you, and just yeah.
What do we do about skills? Because it's not just driving them, is it? It's about the skill set. Because I think Roger is amazing. Roger can do anything. If you go into Roger's house, there's all sorts of interesting treasure. There's a 1960s television that's able to pick up modern television with a homemade aerial. There's a 1950s heater. There's an old phone. There's even an old microwave. And Roger does all these wizardry things because, of course, your background is electronics.
Yes. Yeah.
And he's a very capable man, and that is me being understated. And I've told you that you need to record your knowledge because it will be lost. What else do we do to try and make sure that we don't lose that knowledge? Because I was talking to somebody, what was it? And it was something, and it was, goodness, it was some sort of craftsmanship skill, and all the people that had this, I think it was something to do with Welsh wool or weaving of fabrics. It was weaving of fabrics, and it was a fabric, and it was so fine. It was just so fine. It was see-through, and we'd lost the skills and the technology and the know-how how to do it. And they're now working out how to do it again, and they're relearning it. But I'm worried for the skills for these cars. What do we do to stop that brain drain and keep all those skills and pass those skills down? What do we do, Roger?
I think if you enjoy sort of working with people, then, when you're making a piece for your car, when you're working on the car, get your mates round, get them to, show them what you're doing or anything. Or if they need something doing on their car, if they're a bit hesitant about doing it themselves, say, I often go and help my friends and things and show them what, how to fix it. And often these things aren't particularly difficult, but people have a fear of giving it a go.
Yeah.
And I think main thing is just give it a go. If it goes wrong, what's the worst that can happen? The part that you've made is no good, just do it again or ask somebody. And I'm trying to make some videos of things that I've done. But I haven't actually put up any on YouTube yet, to try and share some of the skills that I've got.
I think you should, because YouTube is one of the world's biggest search engines, and they call it that as well. And it is because I found out so much through YouTube. I taught myself how to crochet through YouTube. I've taught myself how to fix stuff on the car through YouTube. I learn much better through watching video, and I'm sure others do too. Is there any way that we could gently persuade you to put some of these videos on, because they are very good and you are very knowledgeable? Can we push you?
Yes, you can push me. I've got a lot of stuff filmed actually. I just have no experience in editing or anything like that. So I'll try and get something up there.
You should, because it's your wealth of skills is going to be a massive loss if, sorry to be morbid, if you die and you don't record all of this. We're going to lose everything that's in your brain.
Probably crash in some dodgy 30s car or something.
But like that Roger, I watched his video.
Yeah, I think it is really important. I think it's confidence, and I think it's tips of the trade that we need to pass on. Having said that, the skills that I've got, I didn't learn through working with anybody else, because my parents weren't interested in classic cars. I did a lot of metalwork and woodwork at school. So it must be something in my brain that just sees things and works out how they work. So I think if you've got that type of brain, then yeah. You
do have a gift though, and I think not everybody does. And it's worth saying, I was reading a report the other day that said the skills and the craftsmanship that's involved in the world of repairing classic cars is worth over 330 million to the UK economy. So it's really important that we don't lose those skills. And I think that, and I say this as someone who went to university, I think there's a really big push for everybody to be super academic. Oh, you should be perfectly English, perfect maths, perfect science. The thing is that the world isn't built like that. There are some people that are really great with a book, and there are some people that are really great with their hands or working things out. And everybody's skills are important in this world, and I think that your skills are so important and we must not lose them. Do you think that schools need to be doing more?
That's a really good question. I don't really know what is going on in schools.
Not much.
And I took my first engine apart, which is actually a Triumph Herald engine, no, Vitesse engine,
Oh, yeah.
apart in after school club. Someone gave the engine to the school, and we just took it apart, and I saw how it worked. Never got it back together, but so I think yes, maybe that's something that interested me. So maybe if you've got an old engine, give it to a school for the kids to take apart or something like that.
That's such a great tip, because it does make me quite sad actually how school is very focused, and it's right in a way that school is very focused on you getting your GCSEs and all the rest of it, but it just feels like we're putting everybody down this treadmill and we're saying you have to do it like this and then you need to be going to university, and if you don't go to university you're not as good. Whereas actually some of the most talented people I know, and especially that I've met through cars, they don't have a university education, but they've got such an incredible wealth of skills that actually they're the people that keep the wheels turning in this country. You do need the people with the books and the computers, but you also need the people with the tools in their hands. And I guess we've slightly gone off on the tangent here, but without those skills and without that passion to drive forward those skills, you're not going to have the people that can keep cars like this on the road. It's a worry.
It is a worry, but I think perhaps the way in as well is if you think you're interested in a pre-war car or any classic car really, just go for it. If you're technically skilled, and maybe if you're not to begin with, but just go for it, give it a go, and you'll learn. And it's incredibly satisfying when you've got something that needs some work on it. You work out what's wrong with it, or somebody helps you work out what's wrong with it, and together or on your own, you just get it right, and then it's wonderful. It's a fantastically satisfying hobby.
So let's tap into some of the sensationalist headlines before we wrap this up. Sensationalist headline number one: the world of classic cars is doomed because electric is coming and the government are going to remove all the classic cars. What are your thoughts on this?
I think it's very unlikely to happen. As you've just said, the classic car economy is worth billions or millions or whatever. The government is not going to turn off that tap in the economy. So I think there will be ways of keeping it going. I think perhaps the drive has to come from the people. People are talking about electrifying their classic cars. If everybody electrifies their classic cars, then that will be a very different outcome to everybody lobbying for the fuel to still be available.
Yeah.
I think from an environmental perspective, the amount of emissions from the number of classic cars that are on the road compared to industry is minuscule. I don't think you can make an environmental argument for getting them off the road. But as the numbers as internal combustion engines stop being used, then it's going to be very economically tricky to make sure the fuel is available at a reasonable price, and that might drive people off the road.
Well, I think I was looking at, so I've been doing a report recently for work, that's why I've got some of these facts in my head. The average smartphone user and their smartphone in their hand is responsible for more, I think it's got a bigger carbon footprint, your smartphone, in 1 year than your classic car has. So for all those people out there that are watching and someone says to you, oh, your classic cars and all the rest of it, remind them that if they're using a computer or a smartphone, their carbon footprint is bigger. And there was another interesting statistic, and it was around the price of synthetic fuels. Now, I'm actually quite into this synthetic fuel thing. I don't know what you are, I'm going to ask you in just a second, but for anybody that doesn't know, Goodwood Revival, all the vehicles raced on synthetic fuel, and the price on average at the moment is around £3.50 a litre if you're buying it in bulk. Now I think this is really interesting because normal fuel prices have been doing this, synthetic fuel prices have been doing this, and the most interesting thing about synthetic fuel, and what I like about it, is you don't have to change your running gear, whereas with electrifying your classic, I'm not big into that. I mean, it's horses for courses, isn't it? If you want to do it, I'm not going to stand in your way, but I don't think that it's something that I would ever do. So I'm going to ask you two questions now, Roger. Number one is what are your views on synthetic fuel, and do you think it will help keep cars like this going?
I think anything that helps keeping these cars going is a good thing. Fuel in the 30s was pretty diabolical,
Oh,
you know,
right.
so it doesn't really matter if it'll burn, it'll probably run on it to some degree. Yeah, so I think synthetic fuel is a good idea. I'm not so into the electrification side of things because for me personally, I said it was about the aesthetics, that's what got me into it, but the actual driving experience is really important. And the internal combustion engine really, as a method of generating power, is appalling. You know, it isn't what you would set out to put into a car. You know, it has no power at low revs.
Yeah.
So you've got to have the whole thing with the gearbox and changing gear and all of this malarkey, which of course with electric motors, they're the opposite. They have loads of torque at low revs, so you don't need the gears. So the electric car electrification will sort of change the nature of the driving experience, and I think, okay, you might still have the aesthetics, but you won't have the fun of driving, you know, of really trying to get the best out of the car.
No, and Roger said something really beautiful at the pub last night, and I'm going to repeat it, is that he said, it's like meeting someone and deciding you're going to date them and then changing everything about them and saying, well, I like the way they look, but I don't like their personality. I don't like this about them. I don't like that about them. And before you realise it, you're just left with a shell of what you originally saw. And I think you can get into that with classic cars. I won't step into the argument for purist versus modified at this stage, because I think that my views are probably very old-fashioned in that I don't like immense change. I like doing things like, you know, changing a dynamo for an alternator. I think that can be quite savvy especially if you're doing a lot of urban driving. But when you start doing things like electrification, ripping out the interior, changing loads of stuff about it, I think, did you fall in love with the car, or did you fall in love with the notion of driving something different? Because we are mere custodians who are trying to keep these cars going for the future. We are, I would say, us as people who drive and own classic cars and keep them going, we are essentially historians. We are people that help keep heritage for, you know, British heritage alive, and it's very important that we respect that heritage and do everything we can to preserve that. We are preservationists as well.
Yes, I agree totally.
And so we've talked about the sensationalist headline of no fuel, we're doomed, that's not going to happen. But we think probably that's not going to happen. I think that the report I was reading, the classic car market in the economy, so that's everything from sales, restoration, parts, racing, all of it is one big bubble, is worth 20 times what the UK fishing industry is worth. So I think that it is worth remembering that, and all these people that feed into the doom and gloom, and I hate it, I hate all the negativity. Let's dial back and think rationally and say to ourselves, this is worth a lot to the UK economy, and therefore it's more than just a passing concern, and also it's worth preserving. So for those sensationalist headlines that say young people are not interested in classic cars, cars like this are just going to get taken to the scrapyard and forgotten, what do you say?
I think probably...
You can be honest.
I think part of that is true.
Okay.
I think if you look at the number of classic cars generally that are on the road now, I mean, when I was younger, you had, you know, Morris Minors and the Minis and all the MGs and everything like that flooding the streets. You know, I could tell the sound of a Morris Minor just from the exhaust note, and I could lie in my bed when I was a boy and hear them going up the road. That doesn't happen anymore. You know, the number of classic cars you see being used every day has undoubtedly decreased, and that probably happened to cars like this in the 70s or 60s. So I think it's a rolling thing. I think as time goes on, the older cars stop being used and they go into either preservation or sort of occasional use. And so yes, you know, the numbers that are required to be on the road will naturally decline. Now, whether they're going to fade away completely, I don't know. But what I would like to think is that at least the majority of the ones that have survived now will carry on being cherished in some way and maybe used to a lesser extent.
Well, I hope so. And it'd be interesting to know your thoughts at home. What do you think about electrification, the fueling situation, the future of classic cars, and most importantly, the future of 30s cars? And if you've got anything that you're doing initiative-wise, I'd really like to hear about it in the comments section below. It's been an absolute pleasure spending time with you again, Roger, and I look forward to our time off camera as well, where we can nerd out about various things. But this is the thing, you should get out and people should take several leaves out of Roger's book, because Roger really lives those values of keeping the love of classic cars alive. He's generous with his time, he shows people how to do stuff, he's generous with his cars, he shares them, he takes people out, he shows them how they work, he explains things in a really lovely, clear to understand way that isn't condescending or intimidating, and I think that's one of Roger's greatest values. And he will share his tools and expertise, and I think if we all do that and we're generous with our time and our cars and passing that knowledge along, we can keep the love alive, and we don't need to play into those doom and gloom headlines. It doesn't need to be a self-fulfilling prophecy, and cars like this could continue because there's a lot of love for this, and I think that it will definitely survive at least another generation or two.
I'd have thought so. I hope so, yeah.
I hope so, and if nothing else, Roger, you've done your best stab at keeping it going. Now, thank you very much for watching. It's been a little bit of a different one, going off on a tangent about 30s cars and pre-war cars, but the love is still there. The interest is still there. We just need to keep fostering it. So wherever you are in the world, I hope the weather is as lovely as it is today. And until next time, take care and drive safely.